All right. So some of your questions you had in the previous Zoom meeting will be answered here. This is all about threats to the snowy plover and plover protection and management. Okay, so now that you know more about plover biology, it'll be easier to understand how these threats affect the bird. So there are 3 of them, the trifecta of threats, because alliteration is great. It's predation, right? Disturbance, and then habitat loss. All of those things have worked together to affect the plover population. And habitat loss is a huge one, and they're all important and they're all working together here. Habitat loss is one that is, you may not notice it until you kind of take a step back and look at the whole coast, right? So we've got all of this European beach grass, coming in that we have brought in, right? Because we've developed our coastal areas, and as part of developing those areas, we've stabilized the dunes so that the housing developments and infrastructure are protected from ocean erosion. It sounded like a great idea. It worked really well, so well that now the coastal dunes are really uncommon, the way they used to be. The beach grass forms these really high dunes, and this inset picture shows you how deep those roots go. So the roots to that beach grass that's way up here, they're sticking out way down here at the bottom. They can go up to 30 feet deep, and even deeper than that in these dunes. And what that leads to is changing the very shape of the dune. So it starts off, a normal dune. The beach grass comes in and starts sending its roots down. The wind still comes off the ocean and builds sand up on top of it. Then the beach grass grows up through that sand, and that dune gets higher. That lifts the wind. The process repeats. Then during the winter, a storm comes in and erodes that sand down up to the high tide line, and you end up with that sheer cliff. And what that ultimately does over time is narrows the beach. So you don't have those wide open sandy beaches anymore. So this is an example of that process at the Oregon Dunes recreation area. So in 1939, this aerial photo, you can hardly see vegetation at all. It was all way over here on the east side. Then in 1984, there's a lot of vegetation now. And the only reason this stuff back here is still open sand is because we've got, off-road vehicles in it. And then now it's all grown in even more. The off-road stuff is happening over there and to the north and south. But, that beach used to be this whole area. That was plenty of space for people and plovers and predators to all do their thing. But now it's all in this tiny, tiny narrow strip. This area right here is all that's left for all of that activity condensed into this one little spot. And that brings us to predation, right? It's a natural phenomenon that's been going on for as long as eating of other things has evolved. And the prey and predator are always finding ways to overcome one another, whether it's camouflage versus detection. I get better at hiding, the predator gets better at finding me. Avoidance versus capture, I get faster or more dexterous, and then the predator finds a different way to catch me. And also distraction versus focus. And so we've given predators sort of an unfair advantage. Not only is the beach narrow, so now the predators and prey are all in the same spot, but we have also subsidized them, right? So they've got food available and habitat in places that they never had it before. Even unintentional, right? Litter, dumpsters, picnic tables that, folks left their lunch out while they went to go on a hike, and, the food is there on the table the whole day. All of those things contribute to predators doing better than they otherwise would and having a higher population than they otherwise would. And so when that human food isn't available, where do they go? They go out to the beach. We've also had some new predators come in with new tactics that all of our native species aren't accustomed to. And so to answer that previous question about what preys on them, here's a list of all the mammalian predators that we know of. Coyote, mice, and red fox are the ones that are most frequently documented predating on snowy plover nests, eggs, and adults. We also have the avian predators, the corvids, American crow and common raven. They're in the corvid family. They historically have been the highest cause of predation on snowy plovers since we've started monitoring back in 1993. But recently, as plovers have become more populous down on South Coast especially, the northern harrier has become a huge issue. Once those birds figure out how to find plover nests and adults and young, they will decimate the whole area. They're very fast, they're very keen eye, and they will take all the nests in, like a 1-day period. We'll lose 10, 15 nests. We've also documented great horned owl, which was a surprise. Without nest cameras, we would have never, ever known about that. This video here is the nest exclosure I was telling you about earlier, that cage. There's a nest in the middle and a plover sitting on it, and this is at night. That's a great horned owl. So in this case, that nest exclosure put the adult at much greater risk for predation than it otherwise would have been, right? Because he had a hard time escaping that owl. And whenever we have a bumper crop of mice, they get really good at finding nests too. So this mouse is raiding a plover nest at night. The plover is over here. And plovers are small. There's not a whole lot they can do to protect their nests from predators like that. The third one is disturbance. And disturbance happens all the time for a whole bunch of reasons. And there's direct disturbance. That would be things that injure or kill. Trampling of a nest, whether that's a person or a car or an elk. And adults can also be maimed or killed, either by predators, by our dogs, even by people, though that's not as common, though we have had some vehicles run them over. And then there's indirect disturbance. These are things that change behavior. So, we're flushing nesting and brooding adults, which exposes those eggs and the young to weather. And it also affects the energy levels of those adults. So when faced with a disturbance event, whether it's going to be direct or indirect, the birds have a physiological response, right? So they're going to have stress hormones go up, they're going to increase heart rate, it's going to affect their metabolism out there on a beach where they need just about every bit of energy they can get, and too much of it will drop their weight and make them sick. So even though a bird is just sitting there, it may still, have a metabolism that's revved up, that's, ready to react, that's, in a fear-based system that is changing its physiology. And the bird is faced with a behavioral response. It's got a choice. It's going to flee, which has an energetic cost, or it's going to stay in place, and that has predation risk. And this is a harsh coast. So they're always looking for ways to conserve that energy. One of those ways is to hide. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but temperature can be 15 degrees warmer in a small depression or behind a log. So this plover is in a footprint. He's 15 degrees warmer than this guy. It is amazing how much warmer it is. And if you've ever been on the beach and the wind kicked up and you're cold and went and found a big driftwood log and tucked down behind it, it's surprisingly warm once you get out of the wind on the other side of that log. But plovers are tough. They sneak away from their nest to give it the best chance of staying, undiscovered. That's their method of protecting their nests. And on a remote beach, that may happen a few times a day, right? Like a coyote will walk by, the plover leaves, comes back, a crow flies overhead, or, those things happen a couple times a day. But on a beach that has a lot of activity, that means they're leaving their nest multiple times in an hour. That is a drag on the adult's energy, and it also has implications for the nest. Okay. So that kind of gives an overview of disturbance really well in a visual manner. Now that obviously wasn't a snowy plover, right? Because he had orange legs and an orange beak. But the situation is the same, you know, beach nesting bird, all these different disturbance events. And so that's at the heart of why we have recreation restrictions and things like that in place. It's not because one person walking on the beach is responsible for a nest failing. It's because that person and the next one and the next one and the next one, you know, all accumulate and have these impacts. And there's more than just people, right? There's lots of causes of disturbance. Some of them we can't control. Weather events, the predators, other species, the elk go out there, deer go out there, you know, all of those things are out there on the beach all the time. But the human-related ones we can control. So that's recreation. That's also beach management. So like when our beach rangers are out there, you know, picking up marine debris, or, you know, when there's folks responding to a stranded marine mammal, an emergency response, you know, if there's a fire on the beach or a shipwreck, all of these things, you know, happen out there and are causes of disturbance. So with vehicles, that's one of the things that we've restricted on the Oregon coast. That includes cars and off-road vehicles. It includes bicycles, motorized or otherwise. E-bikes are a new thing. Fat bikes are a new thing. And fast is often more threatening. And those adults and chicks will shelter in the tire tracks. So if somebody's driving on the beach and they're following the tracks, they're more likely to run over one of these birds than if they stayed out of those tracks. Kites is another thing that we're restricting in plover areas to help with this disturbance. It's a huge threat to them because it mimics those airborne predators. And this includes, you know, model airplanes, not super common anymore on the beach, but kites, parasails, kiteboarders, and drones are a huge one, right? Like that's a growing activity. People love being able to fly their drone up and get great video of our beautiful coast. But that puts these birds in a constant state of vigilance because they don't know that it's a mechanical thing controlled by a human that has no interest in eating them. The plover just sees the shape up, you know, up overhead. They don't know if that's a harrier, if it's a crow, if it's something they need to be worried about or not. And then there's also horses. You know, Eric asked this question about equestrians earlier. Why horses and not bicycles? Horses do tend to mimic elk a little more than a bicycle does. Their speed is usually a little slower. But there's not a whole lot of difference though. Like horses do cause impact. And so we have to be careful of where those horses are going and how many of them are out there. And even people, you know, pedestrians, jogging, walking on the beach, those can be a source of disturbance as well. And here we've got this was a nest at one point. That's footprints, you know, folks walked by and didn't even know it was there. This is another nest. This was at Nehalem. This is our second successful nest, I think. These folks were walking up along the dune, having a great day. I have no idea who these people are. This was on our nest camera we had on the nest. They had no idea that they were 2 feet from a plover nest that whole time, right? So that was a source of disturbance that bird did not need to have. And another huge one, especially from the bird's perspective, are dogs, whether they're leashed or unleashed. Like from our perspective, a leashed dog is no threat. You know, he can't run off and catch a bird. He's no threat to those plovers. But they don't know what a leash is, right? They don't understand that that dog is attached to the human and isn't going to come after them. To a plover, that's just a funny looking coyote and they're going to react accordingly. Now, I love having my dog on the beach. I do. This is not my dog on the beach. I do not let him chase birds. But, you know, there has been research on it too, and people with dogs out on the beach, when they were within, you know, like 100 feet of plovers, those plovers flushed away from their nests 100% of the time. Whereas if you've just got a person walking, that bird may stay on the nest a lot longer. And I've seen this directly too, when, you know, I was watching a nest, or not a nest, I was watching birds in winter. We were testing to see how they would react to a drone. We wanted to see if we could monitor plovers with drones and infrared cameras. And we had the drone up in the air, and the birds were looking at it like they were in a state of vigilance, right? They were aware of it and thinking about it and concerned, but they stayed in the same spot. They didn't run away. And then a couple people came walking down the beach with their dog, and those birds gone. You know, as soon as that dog got anywhere near them, they were gone. Whereas we were standing there with the drone, and the birds were fine with it. So they have a much higher flight distance from dogs than they do most other sources of disturbance. And all of those things combine together to get us to these birds needing protection. So we had the Federal Endangered Species Act of 1973 came into place. It's administered by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service oversees plover, and it provides protection for all species, subspecies, distinct populations, evolutionary significant units, which is what a lot of our salmon are grouped into. And the Endangered Species Act puts, recovery goals for all of these species that get listed. And those goals ultimately want to get to delisting of that species. So it's self-sustaining wild population. Some of the definitions that are important, I'm not going to belabor it too much because y'all can read, and listening to me read the text to you isn't super exciting. Plovers are threatened. So that means that when they were listed in '93, they were likely to become endangered without management help. So if we did nothing, that bird would become endangered. Whereas an endangered bird or endangered species, if you do nothing, it's going to go extinct. And that leads us to federal take. The endangered species prohibits take. Take has this long definition, and then, as legal things do, the definition needed to get defined, which is what these are here. And harassment is an important one here because that means that it's going to affect, its breeding, its feeding, and its sheltering. What we do when we're monitoring plovers, we are harassing them. It's not to the point that it's going to cause nest failure because we're being aware of what we're doing, right? But it is still technically harassment. And because of that, to survey for plovers during a breeding period, you have to be on a permit. That's partly why we have this long training with all of this content, is to get listed on a permit to do this survey work. You have to go through this workshop and all of this content. And then once you do that, you'll be able to get listed on OPRD's permit and survey for these birds during the breeding period. Plus some field work. If you want to monitor nests, we definitely need to get field work because seeing it in pictures is a great primer, but there's nothing to substitute for feet on the beach. The legal status of the plover in 1975, so over 40 years ago, it was listed by the state of Oregon, wasn't federally listed until 1993, and the recovery plan, so establishing the framework for how to bring them back, was developed in 2007. And that provided management guidelines, recommendations for long-term protection, as well as measurable criteria for delisting the species. Now, recovery means range-wide delisting. Oregon is doing very, very well. So we've had, these birds are increasing their population. We've had a lot of support from partners, from agencies, from the public, and these birds are coming back really well here. In fact, we're kind of the gold star in the region. We're part of Recovery Unit 1, Oregon and Washington lumped together. And then, there's other regions that go down through California and into Baja, Mexico, and they're not doing quite as well there. So in order to delist this species, it would have to be range-wide, not just Oregon. Now, what would recovery mean, right? Like, we can't just stop managing for them. If we stopped managing predators, if we stopped managing recreation, these birds' populations would start to go down again. So if we cannot delist them and get to a self-sustaining population, what does recovery even mean? For us, it means more resilience in the Pacific Coast population, so localized events will have less effect. We'll have more flexibility in management options. hopefully, less permitting would be required. We would be able to have active management needed on plover management areas, but land managers might have some more options. Now, this is if there's range-wide delisting. So what is that recovery criteria? Range-wide criteria would be 3,000 breeding birds. Last year, there were 2,200, so, we have not met that. We want 1 fledgling chick per male for 5 years in a row. And the reason that's per male is because the male provides all the parental care. So remember how the male is the one that raises those chicks? He's the limiting factor with time when it comes to this species. So that's why that metric has been selected. And we also need long-term protection of habitat, and that also needs more work range-wide. Here in Oregon, our goal was 250 breeding birds. We met that in 2012. It's also 1 fledged chick per male for 5 years. We met that also in 2012. And long-term protection of habitat. So we've got habitat protection with Forest Service, BLM, and state parks. All 3 of those agencies are working together to increase habitat, not just protect it, but actually increase it and provide more. So what would happen after recovery, right? Everything goes really well, range-wide, the species comes back, we can delist, but those trifecta of threats are still gonna be there. We're still gonna have beach grass, we're still gonna have predation, we're still gonna have disturbance. So plovers are still gonna need dry, sandy beaches free of disturbance to be successful. And so we'll have to retain a lot of those strategies in the recovery plan to keep plovers delisted. Does that mean it would look exactly how it looks now? Maybe, maybe not. We'll have to see how things go, and Fish and Wildlife Service would be the lead agency in determining how to adjust those recovery issues. But we're getting there, and it's super gratifying to see these birds go to new places. Like, I confess, I cried when I found my first plover nest at Nehalem. After 30 years of them not being there. It was an amazing experience. And just seeing these birds coming back to our North Coast, it's just a really wonderful experience. And that concludes that section. So let's take a brief pause to address any questions you have on that content. We've got a little bit more to do. This goes to 12:30, I think. So we'll cover management strategies and recreation restrictions in the next set. But I wanted to address questions you have on this now so that we don't get too far into that. Dave, is there a preferred color to wear when we walk on wet sand? I remember a book was called Birders Don't Wear White. There's no data on it for plovers specifically. I tend to wear colors that blend in more for, most of my field gear tends to be tan and green anyway. But that is a good choice, like wearing bright red or, those sorts of flashy, brilliant colors. Probably not ideal. For our purposes, it would probably work out. Like, you don't have to go buy a whole new wardrobe just to go on the beach. But, picking things that are less flashy and bright is not a bad idea. Are plovers the top of the list for Oregon coast conservation? That's a good question. If Laurel is still on, she might have some feedback on that. Laurel Hillman is our Oregon Coast planner. She is involved in all things Oregon Coast, so she's a great resource for that.
I am still on, Vanessa. I don't know exactly what the question is. We don't have a prioritized list, so there isn't a list that I'm aware of that has species in an order. There is the Oregon Conservation Strategy that ODFW, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, has produced. So I can send this group a link to that document, and plovers are on that list of species. But I don't think there's anything put in a order so that they would be at the top of the list. Sorry, my daughter is also interested in plovers, so she's been watching the presentation for part of her homeschooling.
I would also say that, this is Joe with Audubon, I would say that, marble murrelets and other, if you're talking, again, the question is a bit unclear if it's on just overall conservation work on birds, but if it's birds, obviously marble murrelets are a species of conservation concern in our state and in the region. And they are a bird, obviously, that uses the coast, uses the nearshore waters for foraging primarily, but they nest in old growth and mature forests. And so There's multiple habitats that there's a lot of concern about that these birds depend on. And there's a laundry list of endangered species and also species of conservation concern, like Laurel mentioned, that are in the nearshore strategy, which is a great document to take a look at and get a good perspective on lots of different species in Oregon that have been identified as species of concern.
Vanessa, you could also talk about the different types of lists that have the rankings if you want. That might be in other types of lists that folks might be interested in. We can send both of those a link to the conservation strategy as well as the list of the different types of listing, like state listing and.
Right. Yeah, that's why it's I'm not sure how to answer that question most effectively, right? Because it depends on what's the metric, which list do you want to know about. So, Forest Service has a list. There's the threatened and endangered species is in one, its own list. At-risk species. So the Oregon Biodiversity Information Center maintains lists on sensitivity. And all of that has implications for who should be of conservation concern. But in practicality, I would say plovers are probably one of the top funded species when it comes to conservation on the coast. So they've been very lucky species in that multiple agencies have dedicated a lot of resources to their recovery. Marbled murrelet is in really dire straits as well, and they have not had that same dedication. And there's probably a zillion reasons why one species will get funding and another one will not. But it's a great segue into our next section though. It does show that if you put the funding into it, right, if you put the resources into it, the time into it, that you can bring a species back from the brink. And that is a beautiful segue, actually. Let me go share my screen. How did we do this, right? They can recover. We've done it with Canada goose. There was once upon a time when the Canada goose was not populous and we were concerned about its population status. Like, really? All these geese on all of our golf courses are once at risk? Oh my gosh. We might have done a little too good of a job with them. We've got the bald eagle that has recovered. The peregrine falcon has just finally reached the end of its monitoring period after delisting. So, it does happen. If we put in the time and effort, if it becomes a priority for not only agencies to spend, but also, nonprofits and the public and all of those folks. And gosh, this says after 20 years, but honestly, it's up to 40 years now of sharing the beach. These birds are showing up in places that we never expected they would come back to. Because of that, right, state parks ended up with our habitat conservation plan. So the impetus behind this plan is that it's going to outline how state parks will minimize impacts to western snowy plover. And state parks has jurisdiction of the Oregon coast. So from Astoria all the way down to, Brookings, state parks manages recreation out there. And because we're the ones managing that recreation, that makes us responsible for take that occurs to western snowy plover. So, some public visitor, goes out to the beach to enjoy their day and causes a nest to fail. Ultimately, that's state park's responsibility because we're the agency that manages that whole shore. So because of that, we needed to get an incidental take permit. This is all the legal stuff behind what we're doing. And as part of that incidental take permit, like we determined what activities are going to happen on the beach, where those activities are happening, and did a whole, population viability assessment and analysis and incidental take analysis of what those impacts would be on the plovers. And then this habitat conservation plan was put into place and developed to minimize those impacts and also to improve, to kind of make up for it, right? Like, we're going to set aside these 16 areas for plover management to produce snowy plovers, to give them a place to nest, to make up for the fact that, the rest of the beach, they're not able to do that, do their activities anymore. And so approximately 50 miles of beach are protected under the HCP with these seasonal recreation restrictions. I don't think I updated this.
It's not updated.
Yeah, because it's 4, it's down to like 2 that are not occupied, isn't it? Or 3? Only 3 of those 16 designated areas are not yet occupied by plovers. But that leaves like 230 miles of sandy ocean shore open to recreation without restrictions at all. And so that was the trade-off that state parks made with the public and with all of our other partners to protect the birds and yet still have people out on the beach. And it's a very different model than what's happening with like the piping plover over on the East Coast. You know, they'll shut down an entire beach where you're not allowed on it, period, because it is there for the endangered piping plover. And so this is a slightly different model, and it's pretty exciting to see that it's working. So these are the designated areas. You've seen this picture before. All of these areas have been picked because of a variety of options, right? There was the long public comment period, lots of feedback from everybody and their brother and their cousin, sisters, aunt, on you know, which areas we should set aside. And so the decisions were made based on a bunch of different criteria. One, that it would provide habitat for the birds. 2, you know, what was the access like? And also, what was the political will for that area? Like, there's some areas that would have been great for plover management, like Pacific City. But there are so many people there already just because of development. It would have been insane to try to bring plovers to that area. It would have been so hard to protect them and for them to be successful. So, you know, a lot of areas, if you see a spot on here that's not listed as a plover area, like, well, why didn't they put them there? Why isn't South Beach a designated site? Part of that is because of, you know, its proximity to, a big city and how unlikely we thought at the time it would be for plovers to be successful there. Now, obviously, they're reacting in ways we did not expect because they think South Beach is just a fine place to be. It surprised all of us. So the recovery actions that are in place are habitat management, right? That addresses the threat of habitat loss. Predator management, so to address the fact that predator populations are much higher than they otherwise would be. So a lot of that is trash management as well as predator control. And then recreation management. So that's getting at that disturbance side of the threats. And that comes mostly in the form of seasonal recreation restriction. Now, we are doing a lot of monitoring. All of you are potentially part of our monitoring plan. And monitoring consists of nest searching, nest monitoring, determine when birds are fledging, and also overwinter survival. That one hasn't been done a whole lot yet. We're starting to look into that now that we have more birds to watch. And the reason we're tracking their population is so that we know what's going on out there. Like, is our management working? What do we need to do to change our management to do a better job? I need to update this one too. Since 1993, we've had pretty intense management on the south coast of western snowy plover. They've been banding the birds for a very long time, and all of that data let us know that the coast and interior populations don't mix, that there's site fidelity, and also to establish population trends. And it lets us understand, what are we doing? What are the changes in predation? Because of monitoring, we learned that northern harrier became a threat to plovers when they weren't before. We know what habitat impacts there are. The south coast habitat is saturated. There's birds filling all of what's available down there, and so it's pushing birds out into other areas like South Beach that may not be ideal, but they're trying to nest there because there's just not enough habitat available on the south coast anymore. As well as new recreation effects like drones and fat bikes and things like that. So here's the population trends since 1991, I think. It's not showing me the date. But as you can see, whoop, that is a lovely curve to see, isn't it? Back in the early 90s, we had less than 50 birds. And now we've got, over 350 at this point. Though debatably, we've got over 400, depending on which population survey you're looking at. So these data are from window surveys, when there's a week set aside and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service organizes a bunch of volunteers to go out and survey all the plover beaches within the same week period. And so it's like a snapshot in time of the number of birds on the beach at that time. So this isn't a total population count, it's just a snapshot in time. And it's useful to see this population trend. So like here, there was a big, huge dip. That was a little alarming. It happens. Like if you look at the overall trend, there are population dips here and there. Maybe it was a bad winter. or it was just really stormy and the birds were hiding from us and we just didn't see them. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons for that. And another interesting thing to note while this graph is up is right here, you see the slope of that trend start to change. Like it's increasing, but it's a little flat through here up to about 2003 and 2004 and 2005. And then it starts to increase pretty dramatically. And in 2003 through 2005 is when we started implementing pretty hefty predator management. We're also restoring habitat. You know, Forest Service, BLM, and state parks are putting in new habitat as much as we can. You've seen some of the habitat restoration out here at Nehalem. We're hoping to do some habitat restoration at Sitka Sedge here in the near future. We've applied for some grants for that. And this is the most immediate way to help those birds. You know, as soon as you put in that habitat, they're in there and utilizing it. And it's amazing to see how fast they respond. Techniques to habitat management are fairly straightforward. There's not a lot of different options. The options come in how you combine them all together to achieve the best result. And that's something that Parks is playing with right now, is trying different methods and different timelines to see what's the most effective and cost efficient. And those methods are, you know, controlling the invasive plants, so getting the beach grass gone. That can be done through controlled burns, through herbicide, a little bit through disking, although disking just breaks the roots up and beach grass can sprout back from a little tiny piece of root like that big. So unless you're killing the plant first, disking it to get rid of the biomass, right, the big piles of vegetation, isn't super helpful all by itself. And then once you've got the invasive plants controlled, you know, then we have to actually restore the dune shape. Because if you just kill the grass on top, you still have that really steep dune, and the plovers don't like that. They need it to be flat. So that's why you'll see really big, heavy machinery out there pushing sand around. And we're also managing predators. This is something that a lot of us don't really like. We don't like to think about. We don't like it being done. And unfortunately, it's at this point still a necessary part of plover management. The working team, Snowy Plover Working Team, is a group of, you know, different nonprofits and agencies working together to manage plovers. We're always coming up with different ways to manage predators. So there's a lot of non-lethal methods, you know, hazing them off, controlling trash, changing habitat, and things like that that we engage in. There's also lethal management as well. Here's that nest exclosure I was telling you about with a person inside to give you a size thing. And these were really helpful earlier on when every nest was precious, right? So, you know, you had to get those nests to hatch, because ravens and crows couldn't get to the nest when they were inside these exclosures. And those were the biggest cause of predation at the time. The risk to those exclosures, though, is it puts the adults at higher risk for predation. And so now we only use these in very specific areas and after raptor migration has gone through. So that's not until, I think, May-ish timeframe. Because you don't want a plover sitting inside a nest exclosure when you've got hawk after hawk after hawk going by every single morning. As far as lethal management goes, it's never an easy decision to have to remove one creature to save another. Most of our control is targeting corvids and harriers now, although lethal management for harriers is the last resort. Usually we try to find the nest and capture them and relocate them. And the whole goal of the lethal management side of things is to reduce plover populations when needed. So if there's no data showing that this type of species is, or, you know, this particular individual is causing harm to the plovers, then we're not going to go remove it from the population. It's also a constant challenge. If any of you have followed crows and ravens, they are incredibly smart. They've got theory of mind, right? They can predict what you're thinking. They know to look where I am looking because my interest is on something, and they will go to see what is interesting me, right? They're very, very intelligent. It requires continual effort, but it does work. Let's see, yes, so we've had new predator threats emerging, like the harrier that I've mentioned. And one of the things we're trying is putting in tree swallow and purple martin nest boxes all along the dunes. This is something that Joe Metzler came up with. He works for Wildlife Services and protects our snowy plovers down on the South Coast. So he's putting up these these nest boxes all along the dune so that purple martins are active in those areas. And he's basically creating little guard towers because purple martins very aggressively defend their nest box. So if the harrier wants to fly from its nesting habitat in the grasses out onto the beach, it has to cross the line of purple martin boxes. We don't know if it's going to work yet. It's a total experiment. He put in some boxes last year. They're putting in more this year. But fingers crossed it'll work, because that will be amazing, right? Like using other species to work for us would be fabulous. And we are protecting the nest specifically, right? So we're seasonally protecting those birds so that they can nest in peace. And that has led to all of these recreation restrictions. If any of you have gone to any of our designated plover areas, you've probably seen signage up. An occupied site is a site that has plovers breeding on it. So they're exhibiting breeding behavior, they put a nest scrape in, something like that. And those restrictions are from March 15th through September 15th. The birds obviously don't read our signs, so they don't stay within our marked areas. They go where they want, and sometimes they start early. But in those restricted areas, there's no motorized vehicles. There's no other vehicles either, no non-motorized vehicles. There's been a lot of confusion when we first started implementing recreation restrictions because people thought bicycles were okay. They're included in the no vehicle thing. No dogs, no kites, no camping or fires, things like that, right? And for everyone else, which is pretty much people and horses, it's wet sand access only. And the goal of that is just so that all of the disturbance is over on the wet sand so people aren't going to accidentally trample the birds. And what this setup does is gives the public some certainty about what to expect where. So on a designated plover beach, you know that these things are happening, but on the unrestricted beaches, you know those things are not happening, right? So if you want to go play on the beach, you know where you can go and not have to worry about, a bird nesting there. We do have only a few unoccupied sites left. They do have recreation restrictions as well, and the purpose for those is to ensure that the site is attractive to plovers. Like, they're not nesting there yet, so we don't have to have the recreation restrictions in place as long, since nests generally aren't initiated very often in late July. It goes through, the seasonal restriction is July 15th. So, in August, you're not going to have plovers initiating a new nest. So if they haven't nested there already, there's no reason to have that seasonal recreation restriction extend that far into the season. It doesn't change current use. All that the unoccupied site restrictions are is that no motorized vehicles and dogs must be leashed. So what does that mean about non-plover beaches, like South Beach, right? So if a plover nests in a non-designated plover area, we call them rogue plovers sometimes, then our beach rangers will go out and put up a circle of posts and ropes around that nest to protect it from trampling. But there's no other restrictions. So people can have their dogs outside of that, little fenced area. People will be, riding their bicycles, doing all of their recreation that they would otherwise do. And part of that was to, one, protect the species and give it some kind of chance. But it's also interesting to see how these birds are adjusting to different types of disturbance. It's been fascinating to see that what we thought were birds that could not take any kind of disturbance at all, some of them actually can take a little bit more than we thought they could. And if you give them the protected space, they will use it. It's difficult because the plovers are attracted to areas where they've successfully hatched. So now we have a number of birds at places like South Beach that are trying to nest, and you'll end up with a nest buffer here, and then a nest buffer here, and then a nest buffer here, and it kind of looks like a designated plover site. So there are a lot of challenges and implications going forward that, state parks and the public and, Fish and Wildlife Service are going to have to think about as the species continues to recover. How are we going to deal with that as we get more and more birds outside of our designated plover areas? All of this comes down to, our stewardship, and I mean us as Oregonians, not state parks specifically, but everybody, their stewardship of the ocean shore is the reason these birds are coming back. And, part of this whole program is to engage with all of you guys to help with that effort. So, what can you do? You can, spread the word. You guys know an awful lot about snowy plovers now and can hopefully, communicate that to, friends and neighbors. when you're out there on your own, you can, beach comb mindfully, watch for that yellow diamond that's showing you're in a plover area, and watch for plovers on the beach. If you see a plover outside of a designated plover area, let us know so that, we can protect a nest if it's out there. And if you want to do more, you're welcome to do special beach cleanups in plover areas outside of the nesting period. Become a plover docent. State parks, Forest Service, BLM all have volunteer programs, and join Plover Patrol, which I think is why all of you are here, or most of you anyway. And that's to survey, I need to change that too, to survey our occupied beaches, monitor their nests and watch them, hatch chicks and fledge chicks out there, which is super fun. I'll be honest, it's a lot of fun. It can be frustrating, but it's also a lot of fun. And, ultimately we are all making a difference. This has been a really, really nice program and really, I keep saying these words over and over again, gratifying, but it's to see, the public come together into this community science to work with Audubon, all of you, and teaching you all these skills and getting you out there watching these birds, and the excitement when you finally get to see one, when you found your first nest, and getting to share that with all of you, because I get to experience that as a biologist. Is part of my job. It's what drew me to this job. But getting to share that with somebody that doesn't get to see it every day, that's just really, really cool. And, we've had some volunteers that have been helping me since before we partnered with Audubon, going back to, 2012, I think it was, surveying these beaches when they were not occupied year after year, and nothing, survey, no, nothing out there. And then to see them finally get to see a chick on their beach. It was amazing. It was really cool. That's all my content. There's probably some questions. I saw the thing flashing up. Yes. Let's see. Could the harrier problem be associated with the beach grass overrunning the dunes? Yes and no. So harriers have a pretty wide hunting area. They will nest in the dunes. They'll also nest further inland as well, in the prairie areas and short scrubby areas. And they'll come a pretty far distance inland. It's very challenging when we have a pair that's hunting the beach, because the best way to trap them, to relocate them, is to find their nest. And it can be very hard to find that nest because you have to watch their flight patterns, and sometimes it's a quarter of a mile, half a mile that way, not near the beach at all. So that's part of it. Our best guess, Dave and Kathy have been monitoring the South Coast for a long time. They work for the Oregon Biodiversity Information Center, and they've been monitoring the birds since 1993 or even earlier. They're the experts. Like, I've learned everything I know from them. Their best guess for harrier is just that the plover's population has gotten to a point where the harrier now considers it a viable food source. Like, it's reliable enough that, I'm hungry today. I'm gonna go to the beach and find me some breakfast. Like, we're hungry. I go to my refrigerator because I know there's gonna be food in it. So, part of it is the density of the plovers. I mean, that's a good problem to have, right? The density is increased to the point where we have a new predator. So the new predator part's not great, but the reason it happened is great. That it's just we've got more birds. How are predators managed? So there are a variety of ways. Right now, we hire Wildlife Services to go monitor those sites. And Wildlife Services works very closely with the plover monitors so that they know what predators are being seen, what tracks are being seen, and they will adjust their tactics accordingly. So early in the year, there'll be a lot of work finding where the coyotes and foxes are at. They'll use traps to catch those. There are a number of tactics for crows and ravens. Some of it's hazing, so just harassing them off the site. There's also calling them in and shooting them that way, which is not super happy to think about. They also use some eggs that have an avicide in it that is targeted specifically to those birds. And so if you're out in the South Coast and you see a chicken egg with a pink stamp on it, that is an egg that has that avicide in it. Now, the avicide, it takes about three or four eggs before enough of that avicide has been eaten to kill the bird. So that if a crow dies from that, it's because it's made a habit of eating eggs on the beach. So it's targeted, right? The crows that are not eating eggs are not getting affected by it. With harriers and great horned owls too, I think, they will try their best to find the nest, to capture the birds, to relocate it. And there's a pretty strict protocol for documenting damage, documenting the predation on plovers before lethal removal of a raptor will happen. There's a whole predator management action plan that I believe is publicly available. So we should be able to send that out to you guys if you wanted to know about it. And again, it's not sexy, feel-good management at all. And we're trying really hard to come up with better ways of managing these birds and managing the predators. But it's something we're stuck with right now. And the data shows really clearly that it's effective. Like, we were not able to get over that population growth until lethal management started happening. And then the birds just took off. So I hate having to answer that question, but I always have to answer it. There were boulders out at Sitka Sedge already working on the dunes.
Bulldozers, I think.
Oh, bulldozers, yeah. Yes, so we did,
2 years ago. 2 years ago,
yeah. Yeah, our beach ranger, Lisa, and some staff from Fort Stevens tried out some habitat restoration work there to test kind of how the beach was going to respond. Because every beach is different, and so we were hoping to kind of learn a little bit about what that beach was going to do before we did a really large habitat restoration project. So we moved some of the sand around, applied some of the herbicide, and kind of watched how the beach grass and dunes responded to that, and then developed our big plan for 30 acres of habitat restoration that we've applied for grants to do. So fingers crossed that will happen soon. COVID-19 may affect that because budgets are a little wonky and probably will be wonky for a while, but fingers crossed that project will still get to happen. Are there any other non-lethal predator control methods we're exploring or using? Yes, so I have a dream of convincing crows and ravens to work for us instead of against us. That's a very complicated training effort to do, but there's some interest in that. Forest Service is interested in that as well, because those birds are very, very, very smart. So if we give them something better to do than come eat plover eggs, they'll probably go do it. Knowing if that works or not is at least 5 years away. I'm hoping that we will get some pilot projects with that in the next 2 or 3 years. I don't know when we'll actually get that going, but it's my dream, gosh darn it, and I want to make it happen. So there's that. Forest Service has really wanted to do a large comprehensive trash management plan and reach out to local communities and plover areas to better manage trash. State parks needs to work on our campground visitors that like to leave their food on their picnic tables and things like that. So there are a lot of things that can be pursued that are not yet being pursued. Most of the non-lethal management is about trash on the beach directly and, hazing the animals off. And hazing, it's very time intensive. And if you have animals that are just moving through, hazing doesn't really have much of an impact, but they do it. So it helps, during that 3-hour period when they're being chased off the beach. How is OPRD managing through hikers on the Coast Trail with dogs? That is a very good question. It's something that, our beach rangers and other law enforcement struggle with, because in some locations, there's no good alternative for them, especially down in the Bandon area where there's a 12-mile strip of beach that's a beautiful hike. There's no good alternative off the beach other than like Highway 101. So if you're there hiking with your dog, and you're not supposed to go through there in the summer because there's plovers, then your only real option is to go out to the highway. So OPRD has a project going with identifying gaps in the Oregon Coast Trail and coming up with alternative paths for that for people that are more appealing than, just hitching a ride or something like that. That's one way to get at dealing with through hikers. Right now, most of the time, it's if they're close to an area, they're recommended you need to get off the trail at this location as soon as you get there, and in the meantime, leash your dog. Does OPRD or APHIS have any kinds of outreach education materials to share with the public related to predator management? Because it's difficult to communicate with the public. And yes, that's very true. We do not. It's something that I've wanted to develop. I think it's better to let people know what's going on and why it's going on so they understand it instead of trying to hide it and pretend like it's not happening. So having some education and outreach, we've talked about it. We don't have any actual materials developed though. I think we should have some. And there's a question, is it known what % of predation events each predator species or species group is responsible for? Does this vary by site? Yes and yes. So on our north coast, we do not know this yet. As we develop our plover patrol expertise and monitoring, we'll get at that information. Down on the south coast, those birds are monitored very intensively. And there's a report put out, which we can send to everybody here. It's publicly available, that Orbit puts together about the monitoring of all of those birds on South Coast. And they have, a table in it that shows this number of nests were taken by crows and ravens, this number by coyotes, this number by harriers, this number due to some unknown circumstance, right? Because you don't always know what happened. And it does vary by site. Across all sites, the biggest predator is still crows and ravens, though, it sometimes varies by year. Like one year, the coyotes were really bad. They were a huge predation issue. Oh, what was that?
I was going to ask too, Vanessa, do you know if that information on predators is quantified from trail cams specifically? Because I know that in the nest monitoring I've done, sometimes people try to use nest remains or egg remains at a nest to identify a predator after the fact.
Yes.
Which is very problematic.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, I'm assuming it's trail cams mostly, and I'm wondering how extensive are the trail cams monitoring along the coast, because that'll obviously influence the reliability on knowing the variation by site of predators.
Right. I do not know how often or how many cameras they put out on nests. The predator information is a combination of identifying the nest remains and the trail wildlife cameras. But Orbic, the monitors with Orbic are very, very careful, where if they don't have really obvious signs, they lump it in the unknown category. So when you look at the table, unknown failure is the highest category of nest failure, because a lot of time you can't tell. Once we got wildlife cameras out there, they did start to see some interesting patterns where, one predator came in and took the nest, and then another one came in and investigated it. So when you look at it, you're like, oh, there's coyote tracks. Coyote must have ate the nest. But when you see it, it was like, no, a harrier came and took it first, and then the coyote came and sniffed to see what happened. So there is some issue with that. One thing that we have discovered is that, well, without the wildlife cameras, we would have never known harrier and great horned owl were even predators, period. We would have never have known that. Harriers rarely leave any trace. They swallow the eggs whole. Crows usually pick them apart, so you'll find nest remnants, shell remnants and things like that. But a lot of the nest is just gone issues, when you look back at the season, at the time you don't know, but when you look back at the season as a whole and compare, all of the nest failures and the patterns and the reasons, you're like, I bet those 20 nests were the harrier, because lo and behold, that beach suddenly had nest success once we trapped this harrier out. But a lot of the time you don't know that during the season. It's only afterwards, when you're assessing everything and analyzing it, that shows up. Laurel did have a comment. She's working a lot, really hard on the Oregon Coast Trail. It's one of her tasks. She had a comment saying that State Parks is working on outreach for the Coast Trail with bloggers, book authors, website authors, to try to get info out there so hikers know not to bring their dog for certain sections of the hike. If there's any more questions, you guys can always email me your questions. I'm here to provide any information you may need. We can also talk about it tomorrow if you're coming to tomorrow's session. Tomorrow we're going over feet on the beach. So what's a survey actually like? What are you looking for? What's a nest look like? What are tips and tricks to find them? As well as a mock survey that Francis has put together. It's really good. I'm hoping you'll all enjoy that. And if you can't make tomorrow, there is also another session next weekend. I think Sunday would be the same content from tomorrow that we're also delivering next Sunday. So if you're busy tomorrow, then you can come next Sunday. And hopefully these recordings work out. So if you can't come to either, you'll be able to get the content that way.
Yep, we're recording them. We'll see how well they come out, and I'll let you guys know. Thanks, everybody, for joining, and great job, Vanessa. And we will hopefully see you all you guys tomorrow, and you'll get a chance to hear from Francis, who is Portland Audubon's volunteer coordinator, working closely with Vanessa and Parks on this project. So see you all soon.